Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, August 15th, 2025. All right, so the first thing I want to mention, this Saturday, I'm going to be releasing an interview on this channel with a guy named Matthew Cockerill, who's a historian and researcher who's done a lot of work on the Gaza death toll numbers from the Ministry of Health, and comparing statistics from previous conflicts. And a lot of the stuff he's found is really revealing of what we're dealing with here when it comes to Gaza. So keep an eye out for that. I'm going to put it out about midday on Saturday. It's just a little over an hour long, kind of a long conversation about that topic that I think is worth checking out. So anyway, to get into the news for today, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Smotrich plans to bury a Palestinian state. So the Israeli government is moving forward with a plan for the massive expansion of illegal Jewish settlements in the Israeli-occupied West Bank that would cut off the northern part of the Palestinian territory from its southern regions, a plan that Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said will bury the idea of a Palestinian state. Smotrich, who he also holds a position in the Defense Ministry that allows him to be involved in the settlement expansion and approve plans and things like that. He announced that he plans to approve the construction of 3,401 housing units for the controversial E1 settlement project, which has been frozen for decades due to international opposition, because it essentially cuts off a big chunk of the West Bank from another part. Excuse me. So Smotrich said he gave a press conference on Thursday at the site of the planned construction. He said, quote, "They will talk about a Palestinian dream and we will continue to build a Jewish reality. This reality is what will permanently bury the idea of a Palestinian state because there is nothing to recognize and no one to recognize," end quote. And in an earlier statement, Smotrich said, quote, "After decades of international pressure and freezes, we are breaking conventions and connecting Ma'al Adumim, that's a settlement, to Jerusalem. This is Zionism at its best, building, settling, and strengthening our sovereignty in the land of Israel," end quote. So he says this is Zionism at its best. And also look at that rhetoric, I mean, from that last quote, what he said there. He said this reality will permanently bury the idea of a Palestinian state because there is nothing to recognize and no one to recognize. I mean, the rhetoric from him is just about as extreme as you can get. And this appears to be his response, because we've seen threats from him and other Israeli officials that they're going to, fully annex the West Bank if these Western countries recognize a Palestinian state. So this appears to be his response to the UK, France, Canada, and Australia, all recently announcing that they plan to recognize a Palestinian state by September. So the Israeli settlement watchdog Peace Now said the Israeli government's Higher Planning Council is set to hold a hearing next Wednesday, August 20th, for the final approval of the settlement construction. The group said the hearing was scheduled at record speed. So this is something that they're moving along very quickly. So this is what Peace Now said. Again, this is an Israeli settlement watchdog that is opposed to the Israeli expansion in the West Bank. The group said, quote, "The E1 plan is deadly for the future of Israel and for any chance of achieving a peaceful two-state solution. We are standing at the edge of an abyss, and the government is driving us forward at full speed. There is a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to the terrible war in Gaza, the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and it will ultimately come. The government's annexation moves are taking us further away from this solution and guaranteeing many more years of bloodshed," end quote. So the news was also strongly condemned by Palestinian officials. The presidency of the Palestinian National Council said that the settlement expansion was a, quote, "systemic plan to steal land, Judaize it, and impose biblical and Talmudic facts on the conflict," end quote. So the next one here, the day Israeli settlers lynched 2 young men in the West Bank. This is from Al Jazeera, and it's an investigation into the murder of Saifollah Musalet, who is an American citizen from Florida who was murdered by Israeli settlers while he was visiting family in the West Bank. And his friend was also killed as well, Mohammed Rizik al-Shalabi, from the area. So one thing, when I initially, covered his killing, the initial story was that he was part of a group that went to one of these villages under pressure from Israeli settlers as kind of a protest to it. But it turns out, and I actually saw his father, explain the story in an interview that he did. But this says, and his father said something similar, that they went to this one area, this olive grove, that belonged to one of the families of the people they were with, just to kind of hang out. And while they were there, settlers who have an outpost in the area spotted them and kind of descended on them and started attacking. And these young men, according to this report and the videos, the friends were hanging out, joking and laughing, when at about 2:15 p.m. they were approached by about a dozen settlers, many armed with clubs or sticks and some with guns. The settlers began to throw rocks at the boys, as videos from that day showed. Another video by Israeli far-right settler Elijah Vered suggested that rocks were thrown by some of the Palestinian young men in response. And then the young men began to run, trying to escape the violent settlers, who called other settlers to join them. And then that started an attack that unfolded over several hours. And, these young Palestinian men were scattered, trying to get away from these settlers who just were relentless in attacking them. And Saif, the American citizen, was beaten to death. And his friend was shot and killed. And another one was tied up, and they were threatening to shoot him. They were apparently shooting around him and, threatening him. Just absolutely horrific. This is terrorism and murder. And this is, what the U.S. is supporting. When we talk about Smotrich's plans, these are Smotrich's, allies, these violent settlers. And they're completely emboldened by the fact that you have people like Smotrich in charge. And the U.S. is funding this. All of the military aid to Israel and all other types of support, especially from this current Trump administration, supports the expansion of the settlements and emboldens the settlers and the violence that we're seeing. So it's just absolutely horrific what's happening in the West Bank, and it's just getting worse and worse. All right, so the next one here, Ben Gvir seen threatening Marwan Barghouti in prison in new video. So this article is from Middle East Eye. So Itamar Ben Gvir, the Israeli Minister of National Security, was filmed going in, I believe, into the cell or into the prison where Marwan Barghouti is being held, and he's been in prison since the Second Intifada, a very popular Palestinian leader. And this is the first time he's been seen in a while, and he's looking old and pretty frail. But Ben Gvir went into prison to berate him, it looks like. This video was released of Ben Gvir telling Barghouti, quote, "Whoever messes with the people of Israel, whoever murders our children, whoever murders our women, we will obliterate them. You will not defeat us," end quote. And it's a very short clip, but it's just, and Ben Gvir has bragged about the fact that he's limiting food and essentially helping torture people in these prisons. He is the Minister of National Security, which puts him in charge of the police, in charge of the prisons. It's just a very kind of sick thing for him to go and berate a prisoner, someone who's been in jail for decades now. He's another one, Ben Gvir. All right, so the next one here, the IDF kills 50 Palestinians in Gaza over 24 hours. So Gaza's health ministry said on Thursday that Israeli forces killed 50 Palestinians over the previous 24-hour period as relentless U.S.-backed Israeli attacks continue across the Strip amid Israel's preparation to escalate its genocidal war. The health ministry said that the bodies of another 4 Palestinians killed by previous attacks were recovered. On top of the violent deaths, Palestinians continue to starve to death due to the Israeli blockade and restrictions on aid. The health ministry said that it recorded another 4 malnutrition deaths. This is a picture of someone who was killed while attempting to get aid. And among those violently killed by the IDF were 22 aid seekers. So the aid killings, the aid massacres continue. Wafa reported that at least 5 Palestinians were killed by Israeli fire near an aid center in Rafah, and at least there was heavy bombing continued in Gaza City. At least 8 Palestinians were killed in the bombing of a house in Gaza City's Zaytun neighborhood, and that neighborhood has really been getting lit up lately. So it's just horrific, and they're planning this big escalation. And the idea is to forcibly displace 1.2 million Palestinian civilians, and if they don't want to leave, they're going to fire artillery at them, according to the Israeli media reports. All right, so the next one here, Huckabee justifies Israeli military killing of aid seekers in Gaza. So I mentioned this briefly yesterday, but I wanted to write a story on it because it's just so absurd. So in an interview published by the Times of Israel on Wednesday, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee justified the Israeli military's shooting of unarmed Palestinians attempting to get aid in the Gaza Strip. Defending the U.S.-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF, Huckabee downplayed the reports of people being killed by the IDF near GHF sites, but he did admit that it does happen. He said, quote, "Have there been instances where maybe people were shot by IDF soldiers? Best I can tell, that has happened," end quote. He claimed that the IDF only fires at civilians when they're being rushed by a large crowd. This is kind of a long quote, but this is what he said, quote, "You have a group of, let's say, 10 or 15 IDF soldiers. They're manning a perimeter. You have 2,000 or 3,000 people who are suddenly rushing toward a position. They're first given a verbal warning, please stop. Third thing, shots fired at the ground. And if they're still rushing toward them, it's probable that some people are shot in the midst of that because the soldiers don't know why they're coming," end quote. So again, he's justifying the IDF shooting and killing these unarmed Palestinians trying to get food. And eyewitness accounts from Palestinians contradict what Huckabee's saying. It's not like these Israeli soldiers faced any threat. And I believe even the story from Haaretz, actually, I should have included that in here. You know, we have reporting from Israeli media that Israeli soldiers were ordered to fire on these unarmed Palestinians, even if there was no threat. And also, we've seen videos, I linked to one in here, of Palestinians taking cover, walking away from a GHF site. They come under fire and they take cover, and the fire continues. So, you know, Huckabee is just, just lying and justifying whatever Israel does. And of course, Tony Aguilar, who's a retired U.S. Army Green Beret who worked at GHF sites, has said that the IDF regularly fires live ammunition at unarmed people as a form of crowd control, or at least that's how they, justify it, which, according to Aguilar, is a war crime. You're not supposed to fire live ammunition at the ground and over the heads of unarmed civilians. And this includes when their backs are turned, when they're leaving the sites to get them to hurry up. They fire at them. And this has involved also firing artillery and tank shells at these crowds, which, I mean, there's just no justification in the world for this. But here's Huckabee, just backing Israel no matter what they do. And anyway, so this is where things get really absurd. So the interviewer, the Times of Israel reporter, was basically saying, oh man, shouldn't they use non-lethal means of crowd control? The interviewer actually said that. Like, if you look at the transcript, the interviewer says, "I wished they were using non-lethal crowd control methods." And then Mike Huckabee said, "Don't we all?" That was his response. And then the interviewer said, "Well, they do have them. Like, there are non-lethal ways to do this." And this is Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel's response. He said, quote, "What are you going to do? Get Girl Scouts to take them in?" End quote. As if there's just no other possible option than to shoot and then shooting people, firing machine guns and artillery shells at unarmed, starving people. I mean, it's just so despicable that he's just justifying it every step of the way. And that's another thing that really struck me about that Tony Aguilar interviews. I believe in the Tucker one, he said that he recommended signs and, to tell people where to go instead of shooting at them. I mean, the fact that there's no signs and there's no clear path. I mean, they could very easily put a barricade, along the way to the site. It's just complete insanity. Insanity is not really the right word for it. I mean, this is evil, and justifying it is evil. And this is Mike Huckabee. This is Christian Zionism, and these dead people being shot and killed, these bodies, that we see being carried back from the aid sites. These are the fruits of Christian Zionism and backing Israel no matter what they do. All right, so the next one here, over 100 aid groups say Israel is weaponizing aid. So more than 100 aid groups working in Gaza and the West Bank have signed a letter saying that Israel is weaponizing aid, a warning that comes as people are starving to death every day in Gaza due to the U.S.-backed Israeli blockade. The statement said that in July alone, 60 requests to deliver aid to Gaza were rejected by Israel over claims that the organizations, which have a history of operating in Gaza, were not authorized to deliver aid. The statement says, quote, "This obstruction has left millions of dollars worth of food, medicine, water, and shelter items stranded in warehouses across Jordan and Egypt while Palestinians are being starved," end quote. So the letter, which was signed by a lot of major aid groups, including Doctors Without Borders, also known as MSF, Oxfam, Save the Children, came in response to a new Israeli rule for international NGOs operating in the Palestinian territories that require them to provide a list of their donors and identify their Palestinian staff, among other requirements. So the letter says, quote, "Unless NGOs submit to the full registration requirements, including the mandatory submission of details of private donors, complete Palestinian staff lists, and other sensitive information about personnel for so-called security vetting to Israeli authorities, many could be forced to halt operation in Gaza in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and removing all international staff within 60 days, end quote. So instead of lifting aid restrictions, Israel is imposing more restrictions on these aid groups. This is an 11-month-old Palestinian girl who is suffering from serious malnutrition. So the aid groups noted that the large number of aid workers, they noted that a large number of aid workers have been killed. They say in that context, they don't have any guarantees that handing over information about their staff wouldn't put them at risk. And the group said that Israel is now using the registration rule to further block aid and deny food and medicine, saying that they're weaponizing aid. And then there's several of these groups saying that they've been unable to bring anything in, some of them, since March 2nd, when Israel imposed the total blockade. And then at the end of May, they allowed a trickle of aid in, a very small number of aid trucks. And then that's when the GHF began operating as well. And these groups also called out the GHF for what it is there. All right, so the next one here, malnourished kids arrive daily at a Gaza hospital. So this article is from the Associated Press. Just a really sad story here, and this is who Israel is starving, who the U.S. is helping Israel starve here. So this is from AP. The dead body of 2.5-year-old Roa Mashi lay on the table in Gaza's Nasser hospital, her arms and ribcage skeletal, her eyes sunken in her skull. Doctors say she had no pre-existing conditions and wasted away over months as her family struggled to find food and treatment. Her family showed the Associated Press a photo of Roa's body at the hospital, and it was confirmed by the doctor who received her remains. Several days after she died, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Sunday told local media that there is no hunger, there was no hunger, there was a shortage, and there was certainly no policy of starvation. In the face of international outcry, Netanyahu has pushed back, saying reports of starvation are lies promoted by Hamas. However, UN spokesman Stefan Dujarric this week warned that starvation and malnutrition in Gaza are at the highest levels. The UN says that nearly 12,000 children under 5 were found to have acute malnutrition in July. The past 2 weeks, Israel has allowed around triple the amount of food into Gaza that had been entering since late May. That followed the 2.5-month blockade. Of course, this is not enough to stave off further famine, because when you have people suffering from malnutrition, they need real medical care and relief. And of course, you have so many desperate people that they're raiding the food trucks and everything. And Alex DeWall, who's a famine expert, says that while better food access might help much of Gaza's population, it will not help the children who are severely malnourished. When a person is severely malnourished, vital micronutrients are depleted and bodily functions deteriorate. Simply feeding the person can cause harm, known as refeeding syndrome, potentially leading to seizures, coma, or death. Instead, micronutrients must be first replenished with supplements and therapeutic milk in a hospital. So, and this is, again, it's just, it's monstrous to deny that there's starvation in Gaza and to deny that it's not Israel's fault. This is Israel's responsibility because of the blockade and all the bombing and the destruction of the infrastructure. And the fact that you see so many people, in the U.S., Americans who support Israel denying and justifying and looking at pictures of starving kids and saying, well, he has cerebral palsy or his mother looks pretty well fed. This stuff is just, I'm just out of words for it. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes continue on southern Lebanon. So this one is from Jason Ditz. So Israel has continued carrying out drone strikes across southern Lebanon, with strikes Wednesday evening killing one person in a car in Hadatha, a village in the south, and wounding two others in another village of Zibkin. Thursday morning saw the strikes continue with another attack on another motorcycle in Idarun, wounding two more civilians. And Israeli ground troops also crossed the border, raiding multiple homes in one of the villages. There was no apparent pretext for the raids. This is they just have kind of a continuous presence in southern Lebanon. It's unclear who the person was that they killed here. It doesn't even look like Israel's made a claim. Generally, they claim whoever they kill is Hezbollah, even if there's no, a lot of times the Lebanese media contradicts that. But the Israeli strikes continue, and there's risk, the way things are moving with Lebanon, certainly risk of always the potential of a big escalation here. But also, Israel's basically just showing with these airstrikes that they can operate with impunity in southern Lebanon, and nobody's going to do anything about it. All right, so the next one here, Turkey defense deal with Syria includes training and arms. So another one from Jason here. So as Syria's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham government, the HTS, tries to grow its national military after the takeover of the country in December, it was inevitable that Turkey, a heavy backer of the HTS during its offensives last year, would end up playing a big role. Syria and Turkey have now signed a defense deal which will see Turkey provide training and coordination help, along with helping them acquire certain types of arms and weapon systems. And this is despite all the massacres that their government forces have been involved in. None of that is a shock. Rather, the big news is what is not in the deal. There's been reports and speculation that Turkey would establish some military bases inside Syria. That was not part of this deal. Israel has been issuing some pretty strong threats over this possibility. Of course, for Turkey, these are Turkey's proxies, HTS. There's also the SNA. I forget if it's the Syrian National Army in northern Syria, who are, essentially an extension of Turkey. And so, they have plenty of fighters and stuff on the ground. So maybe they don't really need bases, but there was a lot of talk about them establishing a significant military presence in Syria. Israel's been warning against it, and they bombed one of the bases where Turkey was reportedly going to establish a military presence. So maybe it's related to that. Maybe the U.S. is telling Turkey not to do it. But either way, they're signing this deal. They have Syria's foreign minister, who is an HTS, Al-Qaeda guy, in a suit to sign this deal. And of course, Turkey is basically HTS's biggest foreign backer, more so than any other foreign country. All right, so the next one here, Putin says Trump is sincere about ending the Ukraine war. So the big thing, obviously, coming up on Friday is the summit between Putin and Trump. And we'll see what happens if they make any progress toward ending the war in Ukraine. I really hope they do. It's hard to be optimistic for a few reasons, but Putin is praising Trump ahead of things here, is kind of setting the stage for some diplomacy to happen. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that the Trump administration was making sincere efforts toward ending the war in Ukraine. Comments that came a day before the summit. So Putin said, quote, The current American administration is making, in my opinion, quite energetic and sincere efforts to stop the hostilities, stop the crisis, and reach agreements that are of interest to all parties involved in the conflict, end quote. The Russian leader also suggested that the U.S. and Russia could make progress on arms control if the talks go well, saying that in the next stages of discussions with the U.S., we reach agreements in the area of control over strategic offensive weapons. And when you say strategic weapons, generally you're talking about nuclear weapons. So arms control between the U.S. and Russia has crumbled in recent years. So hopefully there is some progress with arms control. There's only one nuclear arms control treaty remaining between the U.S. and Russia, and that is the New START treaty that expires in February 2026. That limits the numbers of nuclear warheads that either side can have deployed. It limits the launchers as well, the ICBMs and things that they can have deployed. They're technically have suspended participation in the treaty, but both sides have continued to abide by the limits. But once that treaty is up, then there's going to be no limits on the U.S. or Russia's nuclear weapons. So it's very concerning. And I think in order for there to be any real arms control progress, there's going to have to be some kind of peace or progress on peace in Ukraine. And it's just hard to think that a deal is going to be reached here. The way Trump and the White House are billing this is they're calling it a feel-out meeting. Trump is going to feel out Putin, see what his terms are for a deal. They're going to meet one-on-one at first. And that's going to be Putin's, I guess, pitch to Trump, that this is why these are my red lines, and see what he can convince him of. But the thing is that the Ukrainians and the Europeans don't seem interested in, the demands that, according to the reports that Zelensky is making, just don't seem like something Russia would go for at this time, because Russia has the momentum on the battlefield. They just don't really have a reason to make a compromise. According to Politico, Ukraine is demanding, they're saying that their conditions include keeping the territory that Ukraine controls, Russia paying for damages in Ukraine, and a security guarantee similar to NATO membership, which these are non-starters for Moscow. We've seen that there's some, Russia could make some, back down a bit, because according to the reports, they're saying they want Ukraine to just withdraw from Donetsk, and then they could freeze the lines in other areas. But the Zelensky is saying, and apparently this is what's happening behind the scenes, is saying that he's not going to withdraw from any territory. So we'll see. We'll see what happens Friday. I really hope there is progress. I mean, this is a serious summit, I think. It's being held in Alaska. It's being held in the U.S. So it shows that this is serious business. So hopefully it leads to something good. All right. So the next one here, the U.S. deploys assets to address threats from cartels. So the Trump administration has ordered the deployment of U.S. air and naval forces to the southern Caribbean Sea to address threats from Latin American drug cartels. This was reported by Reuters on Thursday, citing two sources briefed on the decision. The report didn't specify what kind of assets, what kind of ships they deployed, or what sort of action that the U.S. forces might take here. But this news comes about a week after the New York Times reported that President Trump secretly signed a directive to the Pentagon to begin using military force against Latin American cartels, including operations on foreign soil. So this news together is very concerning here. And the Trump administration has also listed several Latin American cartels and gangs as specially designated global terrorists. So they've taken steps toward taking military action against these cartels. And the big concern for me here, I mean, obviously, I think the whole idea is foolish, trying to turn that drug war into a hot war with drone strikes and things like that, I think is just going to be a disaster. But it looks like they're going to try to angle this and basically use this as a pretext, potentially, to go for another regime change in Venezuela, because they're claiming that Maduro is the leader of the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Sun, meaning that the Trump administration may use, again, as I said, this cartel stuff as a pretext here. Because look at what's happening. They label the cartels terrorist organizations. Trump signs an order directing military action against cartel leaders. They declare that Maduro's a cartel leader. They double the bounty on him to $50 million. And now, according to this report, they've deployed naval assets to the Southern Caribbean. Well, what countries are on the Southern Caribbean? One of them is Venezuela. So this is kind of going in a concerning direction here. And you do wonder, I mean, is the president just able to like launch a drone strike in Caracas and try to kill Maduro? With the executive, I wouldn't, not that Congress would try to stop him or anything, but I mean, it would be completely illegal, completely against the Constitution. Again, not that that matters. Of course, we've seen that with the bombing campaign in Yemen and Iran. The Constitution didn't stop Trump there. But I mean, this, if they do something like that, we don't know that that's what they're doing. But to me, this seems to be putting the pieces together here. This is kind of what it's looking like. And the fact that you have Marco Rubio kind of leading this, he was a huge regime change fanatic back in the first Trump administration when they tried to do the regime change against Maduro. So it's concerning. Also, what's the evidence that Maduro is the head of a cartel? I mean, I haven't seen any. And the Mexican president said that she hasn't seen any. She was asked about it. She said, basically, this is the first I've heard of this. And, we don't have evidence of that. And we haven't seen evidence from the U.S. So just a concerning direction that this is all moving here. All right, and the last story here, sanctions are just as deadly as war, according to a new Lancet study. So this article is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute. So Ron Paul, the libertarian-leaning former Texas congressman and GOP candidate for president, has always maintained that sanctions are acts of war, and the Lancet Global Health Journal recently published a study that proves him right. Economists Mark Weisbrot, Francisco Rodriguez, and Silvio Rendon have found that the yearly total excess human death toll associated with economic sanctions across the world is roughly equivalent to the annual human death tolls of active wars and combat. In fact, the study reveals that on average, the civilian deaths caused by sanctions exceed battle-related casualties in kinetic conflicts each year. According to this study, the worst effects on populations across various age groups are caused by unilateral U.S. and EU sanctions against targeted countries. The researchers argue unilateral sanctions imposed by the USA or the EU might be designed in ways that have a greater negative effect on target populations. UN sanctions, they add, have been framed as efforts to minimize their impact on civilian populations, although the extent to which they have achieved this goal remains debated. In the period of 2012 to 2021, for example, the unilateral sanctions annual global death toll on average was 564,258. The study also notes that most of the civilian deaths attributable to sanctions between 1970 and 2020 were children less than 5 years old. And generally, when they talk about sanctions-related deaths, excess deaths, this is about generally, you're talking about medical people with medical conditions that can't get proper treatment because of sanctions, and there's a lot of ways sanctions can affect the medical industry of a country, and of course, there's all sorts of other factors here. So it's different than being killed in a war, and it's generally vulnerable people, old, elderly, young people who suffer these types of deaths, but. This is a form of warfare. This is economic warfare, and it can have serious effects. And this study really shows that. And I remember hearing from someone I know who has family in Syria. In the parts that used to be under the control of the Syrian government, when the U.S. imposed the Caesar Act sanctions, which were brutal sanctions designed to prevent the country from rebuilding. They said it was almost worse than the war when the war was raging. Because of how bad the economic situation got after those sanctions. And the U.S. established this whole, global trade order, global economic order, and then they weaponize it against other countries. And, it might not seem like war to us here in the U.S., but think about how you would feel if you're in another country and you have Joe Biden or Donald Trump coming out and signing orders and saying, we're crushing your economy, which they say about Iran and Russia and everything. Even though Russia, it didn't, they can't really hurt them as much as they can, not nearly as much as they can hurt smaller countries. But how would you feel, if you were suffering economically and you saw a leader of another country kind of bragging about it? So go check that out if you have the chance to kind of get more into the study. But that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from James Carden. Presidents Trump and Putin must seize the moment in Alaska. One from George D. O'Neill Jr. at the American Conservative. Washington really is Israeli-occupied territory. And I think that's probably how a lot of people are feeling these days. One from Jonathan Cook. The West panics as Israel's plans for full control of Gaza heralds a new Nakba. One from Norman Solomon. Democrats should give peace a chance in Ukraine. And our spotlight from Doug Bandow. Trump should not push India to the dark side. So please go check all that out. Go check out our blog. Oh, I did actually 2 big shows today. I went on Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar. We have that in the blog. Talked about the potential for another war with Iran with them. And I also did Redacted with Clayton and Natalie Morris on their show. I was on their live stream. I think they put clips out, so maybe they'll put a clip out from my segment and I'll share that. And then this weekend is the Ron Paul Institute conference. So I think by this point, if you're going, you got your tickets already. I'm speaking at the student conference, the student seminar on Friday, which is the day before the full Ron Paul Institute conference. So I should be there on Saturday. There's actually a chance that I might have to bail for some reasons, but I'm hoping that I can make it. Or what's probably going to happen is I'm going to go to the conference Saturday. I might have to leave kind of early, but hopefully not. Hopefully I could stay for the whole thing. But it's going to be a great event either way, and I hope to see people there who listen to this show. I remember last time I did. But anyway, that's it. And also remember to keep an eye out for the interview that I'm publishing on Saturday. Like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. I hope everybody has a good weekend. Let's pray for peace in Gaza. Let's pray for the Alaska summit to move in the direction of peace. But anyway, I'll be back in a few days. Thanks for listening.